talk is unashamedly parochial. All my slides from County Wexford to just familiarise you with the material which is local to here, as described in the introductory talk today. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay. So I want to talk specifically about earth mortar, not about mass earth. They're obviously incredibly related, and as Barry pointed out earlier today, they're very much in a related tradition, but I'm talking specifically about earth mortar. And again, as Barry pointed out, there's no huge evidence for earth mortar or indeed mass earth in Ireland before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in 1169. That may well be to do, I feel, with 19th and early 20th century conservation techniques. That's a whole other discussion. We do know that from at least the late 12th and early 13th century, buildings were being built bonded with earth, built of stone in Ireland. Here in County Wexford, actually in all of Ireland, one of the largest walled towns in the country is the town of New Ross, which is just about 25 minutes drive from here. The wall of New Ross was built in or around about the mid 13th century because people inside the town didn't like people outside the town, as defensive town walls get built for all around Europe. Now there's a brilliant poem written in French about the walling of the town of New Ross. It's dated to 1265, thereabouts, and the poem says, the people of the town wanted to build a wall, so they summoned labourers to do the work. But the labourers got little done, and so they dismissed the labourers and did the job themselves. Which goes to show that then, as now, building in earth is probably something best reserved for the self-builder stroke lunatic. Anyways, this is the town wall. It's built of local fieldstone, it's rubble, it's not very well coursed. However, it stood up for almost 800 years. Now, it had a significant intervention in the 17th century, again because of a little bit of a war that was going on, and it was rebuilt in places, it was line pointed in places, but where the line pointing has failed and where the core is revealed, as in the shot on, well, your right, my left, it's earth bonded almost throughout, or certainly wherever any conservation works have revealed it. So it's really interesting. You've got this big infrastructural project being built by a town community, and they're building it with earth instead of lime. You could say that's for cost saving, or you could just say because they know it's going to work. Earth mortar is encountered obviously in conservation projects as well as archaeological excavations, but it's very rarely considered as a modern building material. It's hardly even considered as a modern conservation material. On the left hand side, this is a mid 19th century North County Wexford vernacular wall. As you can see, it's flush pointed all the way out to the edge of this lovely granite stone which proliferates in North County Wexford underneath the Black Stairs Mountains. Am I going too quickly? No, we've all got me. Good. And on the right hand side, you've got a typical Irish conservation stroke restoration stroke extension project where you've got a nice 19th century small stone, in this case it's actually mortar, lime bonded stone farmhouse, and the footings going up for the extension are of course the ubiquitous concrete block and concrete mortar. Now interestingly, my rural vernacular would describe the stuff that's holding those concrete blocks together as muck. So when I mix cement and sand and put it in the wheelbarrow, I call that muck. And when I walk out in the field and the cattle have made a mess in the gate and it's all wet and all that other stuff, I call that muck as well. So you get this kind of surviving vernacular trade language which refers to concrete as a bonding agent as muck, which goes to show, I think, that you just have this passed on oral tradition where people were very familiar with using earth to bond stone until relatively recently. Anyway, I think that for those of you who are thinking about new builds, would most people use earth bonded masonry? Probably not, it's quite labour intensive. But you all have to use, if you're using mass earth buildings, you all have to get your muck up out of the ground, and you have to separate your mass earth from moisture. And I think in that context, as described by Barry actually in North County Dublin amongst other places, earth bonded masonry has a really valuable modern contemporary use in the footings of cob structures. That's not really my area, so I'm going to move on from there. Now, earth mortar stone buildings include fine public architecture, and this again is something Barry alluded to, and Mark did as well. There's a perception that earth building, mass earth or earth masonry is a real kind of lower socioeconomic, small weight building. This again is New Ross. Did I mention that the local town of New Ross is the biggest walled town in Ireland? It also has one of the largest medieval parish churches in Ireland. This is a really substantial 13th century fine piece of architecture. Here, St Mary's Church in New Ross. Go and visit it, it's really nice. Anyways, St Mary's is built in the early 13th century by William Marshall or his immediate family. William Marshall is the Earl of Pembroke. He's the Lord of Leinster. He's the guy who, with his wife Isabella, an Irish woman, has founded the town of New Ross. They build this massive big church, and they bond at least parts of it with earth. It's not a cheap choice. These people are importing an Oolitic limestone from the island of Great Britain, Dundry stone. Anybody who works in conservation is familiar with it. They're bringing it all the way across the Irish Sea, up the River Barrow, and they're putting it into their fine, almost cathedral-esque church. And yet, when they come to bond the church, they use earth, which is really interesting. The masons who worked on this, master masons who worked on this project, were so confident in the use of earth that they used it in the 13th century crypt. And if you're going to decide where to put earth, you would generally try to keep it out of the ground. The crypt is underground. And you'd probably try to not exert too much sideways force on the structure, and yet this crypt, which is barrel vault, is bonded in earth. It's really interesting. Now there is lime in it, that's a whole other discussion which we'll get to if we have enough time. Now, earth, mortar, stone buildings include higher class domestic architecture. I'm just trying to get away from the poverty image. I'm staying medieval because I'm an archaeologist. I'm going to move on into modern period, or the relatively modern period fairly soon. This is Rathmacnee Castle. It's just outside west of town. You have tons of time to go and see it. It's publicly visible, it's for free, and you get added to tomorrow's excellent field day. Rathmacnee Castle is a tower house, very like the Brochs from Iron Age Scotland. Tower houses are later medieval defended residences in essence. Now, Rathmacnee Castle is built in the 15th century. The castle is here on the left-hand side, and as far as we can see, it's lime mortar bonded. However, this has been substantially conserved by the Office of Public Works throughout the 20th century, and it's very difficult to see what the original pointing agent might have been. The Bawn wall, that wall which encloses the defended farmstead of this minor castle, is, however, unconserved and originally bonded with earth and still pointed in places with earth. That's the left-hand structure where the entrance is. It's 500 years old. This is the apex of class of rural domestic structures in Ireland. It's not a cheap building to put up, and yet it is bonded successfully with earth mortar. Now, how much in time wise? Am I okay?
Give you that one now.
I've got 10. Right, okay. Whew. Right, that's okay. I'll slow down a little bit because actually I've got three people very quickly. Right, okay. So the common perception of earth mortar, as Barry said, often includes the later vernacular architecture, and vernacular architecture in Ireland is almost exclusively considered to be 18th and 19th century. Barry's already told us that that is not true. However, I do have an 18th and 19th century pair of photographs here. On the left hand side, this is a domestic structure. This is one of the composite earth and stone, half-hit, thatched cottages referred to by Barry already. And as Barry said, obscured by plaster. Look at that lovely concrete render on the outside of it, so you don't know what it's built out of. On the right hand side, this is South County Wexford. On the right hand side, there's a later, mid-19th century farm building, outhouse. This is made of the granite previously alluded to, which is common in North County Wexford, and it is entirely earth bonded, and there is no mass earth visible in the vernacular farmyard here on the right hand side at all. But yet all the surviving masonry is earth bonded. There's virtually no line on site at all. So obscured by concrete render, this is the 18th century hip-roof cabin referred to earlier. It's at least 18th century in date. I certainly can't say it is any earlier. It's definitely not 19th century. I'm pretty sure it is. It's the very first years of it. It is 3-bayed. It's got a nice doorway. It's got 2 windows, and this block window here on your right hand side was the actual buyer entrance, because this building would have been shared by livestock at the bottom end of it. And you can see the hip roof referred to by Barry earlier, because it's earthen. It's actually quite mass earthen, the top a couple of feet, because it's earthen, has this lovely shape and profile where you can still see the curve of the thatch roof which once sat on it. The walls are, again, as described by Barry, they're around about 500 mil, 600 mil thick, and it's been sitting there in perfect state of preservation for about 200 years, which just goes to show that earth works, whether it's mass earth or whether it's earth bonded. The reason, of course, it works is the thatch roof came off and the corrugate roof went on. Anywhere we find earthen buildings in the Irish countryside, if the roof comes off them and it is not replaced, the earthen building turns into a pudding fairly quickly, which is the problem with conserving these structures. They're not consistently roofed. I don't know exactly how old that corrugate roof is. Barry has a particularly interesting corrugate steel. He can probably tell me. I was in a farmyard last week and I was looking at a really nice 2-story building, and I was commenting on the quality preservation of the concept of the corrugate steel, and the guy said, yeah, that was put on in 1901 by my great granddad, and we paint it every 10 years, and you would swear, except for the thickness of the gauge of the steel, that it was brand new, straight out of the builder's merchants last week. Anyway, earth mortar varies in consistency and makeup. We're staying here in the more modern period, left behind the archaeological medieval period for the moment, and you can see North County Wexford, granite, a really fine-grained clay, flush pointed, very well preserved. Again, this is a roof structure, and on the right hand side we leave behind the granite, which cuts nicely into these raw square blocks. We start looking at a field stone of a quartzite makeup, and you can see how rough this mortar is, and you see little white lumps in it. There's unslaked quicklime in it. This quicklime has been added to it to increase the strength and probably the workability and moisture resistance of the mortar. Again, am I speaking too quickly? Can we understand me? And so you can see that these people had access to lime resources in the mid-19th century, and they considered it an advantageous addition to that mortar, whereas the people on the left-hand side didn't have any lime. Why don't they have any lime? Are they too poor? Are the people on the right-hand side more economically advantaged? In reality, the right-hand side farmyard occurs in a place where there is limestone, which can be burnt locally to produce lime. On the left-hand side, on a granite mountain range, there is no limestone, so you have to import limestone to burn to make lime. It's just not a locally available product, so you just see a vernacular reaction to available building materials, which is really quite interesting. Earth mortar has distinct pros and cons, and this applies to whether it's a new build or conservation or the medieval period or whatever it is. The strengths, the pros of using earth mortar: it's really cheap. You go and you dig it out of the ground. It's commonly available, unless of course you live on the very stony western seaboard. Here in County Wexford and County Meath, as Barry said, we have really deep glacial drifts. You can get a really compact, at times quite sandy clay, and you can use it. It's simple to use, 5 minutes. It's got good insulative qualities, it's got great moisture permeability, all that kind of stuff. What's wrong with earth mortar? Why don't we use it? One big problem, which isn't decreasing as a problem, but it's still there, is few experienced practitioners. Very few people from a conservation perspective, excluding some really skilled masons who are brilliant with earth mortar. Very few people used to using it. It's extremely labour intensive, we all know that. It's got low tensile strength. It's very hard to put any kind of a force on it that will twist it without it cracking. And it's got poor erosion resistance. And for those of us who don't like getting our hands dirty, it's quite mucky. But I've been up to the work area, it's brilliant, and I don't think that's going to affect you guys. Listen, from a conservation perspective, earth mortar is extremely sensitive to rainwater ingress. I showed you this photograph already. Lovely unslaked lumps of lime and an earth bonded wall. I took that photograph very shortly before the roof sprang a leak. Came back a couple of years later, and this is an inside photograph, it's not even outside. 150 years later, in just 5 years, the earth mortar starts to wash away because of the trickle coming through and it pushes it out. It needs ongoing maintenance. This is on the tour for tomorrow. This is a brilliant site just outside Wexford Town. This is the 13th century parish church of Rosslare. It's entirely earth bonded, certainly earth and cord. It was lime plastered internally. Again, when you're talking about a building that's 800 years old, it's very hard to say whether it was originally earth pointed or a later addition has come along and earth pointed. It's certainly earth plastered inside and hasn't seen any conservation work since the Reformation. So this has sprung a leak. And a lot of people will say it wasn't even supposed to be funny. What's happened is rainwater's come down through the gable, the unprotected gable top, it's washed out and it's pushing stones out. That building is collapsing as we speak. You will see tomorrow that it's in worse condition now than it was in this photograph. It was taken a couple of years ago. Clearly, if you build your building out of earth, Plants will like it, and they'll grow in it, and they'll burst it apart. So earth vegetation is a bit of an issue when it comes to earth and building, but that can be dealt with ongoing maintenance. Unless, of course, you've got a grass roof on top of your earthen building. That's a whole other issue. That seems great to me. Anyway, without adequate rain cover, catastrophic failure is inevitable. Talking about class and returning to the medieval period. This is the 15th century tower house, again like Rathmacne Castle. It was built by a guy called Barrett. He was the Bishop of Wexford, and he was having some problems with the neighbours in North County Wexford, so he moved to New Ross. But I mentioned that New Ross is the biggest walled town in Ireland. It also has the largest tower house that we know of that was built in medieval Wexford. So it's a really high class place. The Bishop built this. This is the Bishop Palace, I suppose. It's earth bonded. This is the wealthiest guy in Wexford, building the biggest tower house in Wexford. He gets loads of stone and he bonds it up with earth, and it works really well until the roof comes off. In fact, there hasn't been a roof on this structure for well over 2 centuries, and even at that, 10 years ago, it still looked like a really impressive building. Very sadly, eventually the rainwater will start to percolate down through the walls. It'll find itself a channel, it'll turn the mortar to slurry, and you'll have a catastrophic failure. That tower house, a couple of years later, ended up on the public road beside it, which is a little bit of a sad thing. This is the same structure, by the way, and that is the corner which collapsed catastrophically, literally overnight. The whole thing just went whoop. That's not going to happen with cement, but it probably will eventually happen with lime mortar, and it will really, really happen with earth mortar. So you do have conservation issues. If that building had been adequately waterproofed, even without a roof, that wouldn't have happened. So you need to conservation issues when it comes to earth mortar building. They need ongoing intervention. Time? Is that a 1? A 1! Right, okay. And yet with simple care, earth mortar walls will last for centuries. This is the aforementioned Rathmacne Castle. The reason it's an unroofed structure, the reason this is still standing 500 years later, is the masons who built it put a water shedding, almost flaunching course on top of it, so when rain lands on that big, the wall is like this, the rain just sheds away from it. Rain doesn't percolate through this wall. And as you can see, it's still fit for purpose 500 years later, or at least these people are checking the light in their hands if it's not. Conservation principles. You guys don't really need to know this, because you all know it. I can tell by what you were talking about earlier as I was chatting to you. Like for like principle is the way to go forward for conservation. I show this photograph because it's just up the hill. Go and have a look at the round tower. It's a 19th century round tower, recently repointed by Western County Council. Yes, lime pointing, because lime is what was in it. But where earth mortar is present, lime mortar is obviously not always an ideal conservation option. If you're getting earth in your wall, you should replace it with earth, as long as you don't have a huge moisture permeability issue. Mixing earth mortar is really simple. Some of the photographs Barry was showing from long ago were exactly the same as what we do on little small conservation projects now. There's a little bit of straw added here for tensile strength. The whiteness of the water suggests that there's some lime going in, because the farmyard that this was in had lime in the earth mortar. The old-fashioned way to do this, as Barry described, was of course to get your bullocks to walk backwards and forwards to it. And if you're really lucky, your bullocks will defecate in your mortar mix, because that's really sticky. Speaking of sticky, because obviously you guys know earth mortar, if you use a 2-clay rich mixture, it's going to crack like crazy. So depending on the subsoil adjacent to the building that you might be working on, dig it up, add some sort of an aggregate. On the right hand side, that's a 5 mil down to 1 mil sand, which is locally available in Wexford, and that's ideal as a replacement material. Again, lime, those of you who used to work with lime, always wear eyeglasses. It's a bit burning when it gets in your eye. Lime, received wisdom and experience seems to suggest that if you're adding lime to an earth mortar mix, kind of 3 to 5%, just a really little bit, just to kind of speed up the set. Don't put in too much, it'll crack like crazy because it just sucks all the moisture out. It definitely does aid in going off that, sets it off a lot quicker. And then this is, again, 19th century little farmyard building, being conserved, being repaired, I suppose, would be a better word than conserved. You've got horrible big joints. You should really rake out all the loose stuff and wet the absolute heck out of. If you've got a 200-year-old earth mortar wall and you're going to fix it, you need to wet it so the old material that you're fixing will absorb the moisture back from the new earth mortar you're putting in. And you just pack it up on a like-for-like basis. Hopefully you've got the collapsed stone that came out of it. put it back in, mix up your mortar. If there's straw in it, put straw in it. If there's lime in it, put lime in it. Try to replicate what you have got done. And this is the same wall with some mortar being joints prepared. Again, it's really important, if you are earth mortaring up walls, not to let it freeze and not to let it wash out. So like building with cob, keep it weather protected, don't let heavy rain hit it, don't let it freeze, and Bob will be your uncle. And there you go, use locally available materials, clean back down, and if you have some straw that's local, sand that's local, clay that's local, or lime that's local, you will end up with an effective conservation repair of earth mortar walls. So what's the answer? Why are we going to use earth mortar? Because it's child's play. This is a genuine photograph of monkey see, monkey do. I came around the corner and this little 4-year-old was building an earth mortar wall because that's what was going on in the farmyard beside him. Don't let your kids play with lime. If there's lime in your earth mortar, don't let the kids play with it. Other than that, let them play with it. It's great crack. That's it. Did I do 15 minutes?